Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second session here. This is the evolution of fair housing for LGBT communities. This is part of the NPLS 2021 Virtual Fair Housing Summit. As we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that because this is a CLE, we are recording and we will be administering two separate participation polls throughout at different points. If you would like to have CLE credit, if you're an attorney, please respond yes to the polls. You do need to respond to both of the polls in order to get credit. So pay attention and respond to those. I'll leave them up for about 2 minutes when they're up. And then and Adrian has so kindly added a couple of slides just to remind me to ask the polls. So we appreciate that. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and turn over to Matt Martin, who's going to introduce the session.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Martin. I'm an attorney with North Penn Legal Services, primarily focusing in housing issues. So just as a reminder, throughout the presentation today, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat box. We will address them as they come up when possible. And I have the pleasure to introduce the speaker today, Adrian Shanker. Adrian Shanker is Executive Director of Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and editor of the critically acclaimed anthology, Bodies and Barriers, Queer Activists on Health. He serves as a commissioner on the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and as a commissioner and health committee co-chair on the Pennsylvania Commission on LGBTQ Affairs. Adrian, the floor is yours. Go ahead and unmute, Adrian.
Thank you so much, Tim and Matt, and to the whole team at North Penn Legal Services for putting on such an important online forum on fair housing this year. And today we'll be talking about the evolution of fair housing for the LGBT community. And again, I'm Adrian Shanker. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm Executive Director of Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center. And for the benefit of anyone who's, who is low vision, I'm a white man with a black shirt sitting in front of a purple virtual background with Bradbury-Sullivan Center's logo on it. As a disclosure, I am a commissioner on the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, which adjudicates fair housing cases and has enforcement authority over Pennsylvania's fair housing laws. Nothing in my presentation today is an opinion of PHRC or a policy of PHRC. I'm not making policy or speaking about any potential or future cases. I also cannot answer questions or clarify anything related to any pending or future cases before PHRC. If there are questions related to PHRC specifically, those are questions I will not be able to address today. With the exception of saying that PHRC's LGBT guidance, which I will discuss, is on PHRC's website. And I will speak about what the existing guidance says, but I won't be able to speak about any potential cases in terms of how the commissioners may view certain cases utilizing those guidances. And I also always make a practice of starting my presentations and trainings by decolonizing the space that we're in. So even though this is a virtual presentation due to COVID-19, we're talking about fair housing in the original unceded land of Lenape people. We're literally here in the Lehigh Valley on unceded walking treaty land. And we should acknowledge that as we're talking about fair housing for LGBTQ people, we're doing so on stolen land. Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center provides arts, health, youth, and pride programs to celebrate and support the LGBTQ community across the greater Lehigh Valley. And one of the programs that we offer is a free LGBT legal clinic where we do provide assistance for community members related to housing, employment, public accommodation, discrimination. I am personally obviously not involved in those in that effort. I'm also not an attorney. So I'm speaking today as an advocate and activist and community leader, but I'm not an attorney. So we do have a legal clinic that is staffed by a number of pro bono attorneys from a variety of different law firms in the region. And today, our learning objectives are that first, we'll review current housing protections for LGBTQ Pennsylvanians, and then we'll discuss the protections that are still needed, essentially the gaps. What are the gaps in the protections in fair housing for LGBTQ plus people? And then we're going to discuss fair housing advocacy to achieving equity for the LGBTQ plus population. What this is not is that this isn't like a gay 101 or like a, what is a transgender person. That's not the purpose of today. We also provide trainings including for law firms on cultural awareness and equity. And if that's what you're looking for, that's not what we're going to discuss today, but we're happy to talk to individual law firms or agencies about that type of training. Today, we really are going to focus on fair housing and talking about some of the unique and emerging and evolving changes in fair housing for LGBTQ plus people. So we're just going to try to stay, within that framework today.
Yeah.
So if I could just ask everyone to be on mute, please. So we'll start just with the framework that housing is a human right. And this is articulated in numerous UN declarations, including Article 25 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their family. The 1948 document uses male pronouns, and I'll change that here, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstance beyond their control. So this was in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the most ratified declaration at the UN level. Similarly, the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, another UN document in 1966, continues this trend of housing as a human right by stating that state parties, essentially countries, to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for themselves and their family, including adequate food, clothing, housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions. There's a number of other UN declarations, including the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination of Women, the UN declaration that deals with racism, that also include, and also the one dealing with disabilities and migrant rights and children. All of these declarations also specifically name housing as a human right. And while the US tends to ignore global human rights declarations in favor of constitutional law, I think it's useful to start with this perspective that what we're not just talking about is what Congress has enacted or our state legislature has enacted, but that this conversation today around fair housing for LGBTQ plus people fits within a UN framework of housing as a human right. And of course, if we acknowledge that housing is a human right, then we cannot accept a system where a group of people are denied fair housing protections based on immutable characteristics. And those characteristics already in law include things like race, right, and disability, and there's characteristics that are already listed in law and not currently listed or enshrined in the Fair Housing Act is sexual orientation and gender identity. But we should acknowledge that if we see housing as a human right, we have to see sexual orientation and gender identity as equally necessary for housing protections as the currently enshrined protected classes in our federal and state civil rights laws. And so we're just going to open up a quick poll here. And I'll just also remind everyone that if you have questions up to this point, you are welcome to put them in the chat. And Matt, if there are any questions, an invitation to, I'll just take a pause for a second. So if there are any questions, an invitation to ask them.
Not seeing any questions in the chat box at the moment, Adrian.
Okay, great. So just quick technical thing, I apologize. With the screen share, I can't see the slide with the poll thing up because it blocks my screen. So I think
if you respond to the poll, it will go away, Adrian.
Okay. I also can't see my mouse with the screen shared, so it's going to take me a second here. Oh, wait. Okay, Tim, I'm going to have to wait for the poll to be over to, I can't get rid of that.
All right, I've got about 30 seconds left.
Okay, no problem.
There is one question that looks like just asking about if the slides will be available to download, and Blanca, I'll let Adrian address that, I guess.
Yeah, we typically don't provide the content of the slides itself. However, I will share my email address at the end, and if you have, you can send me an email and we can discuss it. I'll share my email now as well, which is Adrian, ADRIAN, at Bradbury-Sullivan Center.org. I'll put that in the chat at the end when my screen isn't shared. Okay, now I can continue here. So the journey so far, when we're talking about, so we looked just a little bit very quickly at the UN level, and now we're going to look at the US level. So the journey so far, so 1968, as all of you know, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law, landmark civil rights bill, changed the trajectory of fair housing law in the United States, and very significant for so many populations, I would argue, including the LGBTQ population, even though LGBTQ people aren't explicitly enumerated into this law. And frankly, some of the terms that we would use now, like gender identity, weren't even really terms that were utilized then. So in 1968, Fair Housing Act signed into law. About 8 years later, in 1976, Pennsylvania's Governor Milton Schaap created the first in the nation statewide commission to address LGBTQ issues, and it was called the Pennsylvania Council on Sexual Minorities. This is pretty early for this type of a state level government body. 1976 is very early in the timeline of LGBTQ civil rights. By context, the Stonewall riots happened in 1969. The annual reminders began in 1965. So really, we're talking about not much longer after that. Also, for context, the first known case of HIV was 1981. So if we're talking about this like liberatory period in between Stonewall and the beginning of AIDS, when we're seeing the first government effort in Pennsylvania and the first one in the country that's a statewide commission to specifically try to address legal challenges and legal barriers for LGBTQ plus people. So the Pennsylvania Council on Sexual Minorities was short-lived. It was not continued by future governors, but it set the stage in many ways for conversations here in Pennsylvania. For example, one of the actions that was taken by Governor Schaap alongside this commission was the first executive order in Pennsylvania that banned discrimination in the workplace against state employees if they were gay. It was expanded under Governor Rendell to include the words gender identity as well, to incorporate transgender people. But in 1970s, we did get the first executive order, and that executive order was continued by every governor, Republican and Democrat, since. So it is very significant. It does not relate specifically to housing, but as we're going to discuss, employment and housing discrimination protections have really gone hand in hand throughout this journey. In 2002, the city of Allentown added sexual orientation and gender identity to the city's Human Relations Act. This is the municipal law that protects LGBTQ people from discrimination here in the city of Allentown. Allentown was actually, I believe, the first city in the state to include gender identity specifically. And and it spurred a lawsuit and a voter referendum. The lawsuit went all the way up to the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court, and the case is called Hartman versus City of Allentown. And the court ruled that municipalities have the right to, at least third-class municipalities have the right to enact more stringent civil rights protections than the state does. So that there is no preemption for municipal non-discrimination laws, unless the legislature were to specifically create a preemption law, which they have not done. So municipalities have the right to create more stringent civil rights protections than the state. And this case really spurred a large number of municipalities in the state, currently more than 60, to pass their own laws. A number of these laws passed between 2005 and 2011, but they were mostly in pretty progressive spaces in the state, mostly, cities. And in 2011, when the city of Bethlehem passed its own Human Relations Act, that was really a pivotal moment where, and actually Doylestown Borough passed theirs in 2010, right before Bethlehem. Really, those two, Doylestown and Bethlehem, spurred an enormous number of municipal protections to pass. More than 20 in Montgomery County alone, for example. 20 municipalities in Montgomery County alone passed non-discrimination protections in short order. So the landscape in Pennsylvania started to shift. Of course, that landscape then led to a patchwork of civil rights protections. And this patchwork today is both confusing and unsustainable. But at the time, it really felt like a sense of urgency that if the state of Pennsylvania, in particular Pennsylvania's legislature, would not enact a statewide non-discrimination law, then it would be up to municipalities to do so. Some of the benefits of this are that people currently today who reside in the city of Bethlehem or the city of Allentown, and then many other municipalities in Pennsylvania where these protections currently exist, have legal recourse against discrimination through a municipal body. The challenge is that these municipal bodies vary significantly between municipality. Most are all volunteer. Allentown actually does have a staff person from the city, a human relations officer. Her name is Tatiana Tooley, for anyone who might be someone who files complaints on behalf of clients. Another challenge is that complainants have to completely exhaust all administrative remedies. So this added another layer to administrative remedies, right? So in addition to filing at the state or federal level, now there's a local level to file with. There have been MOUs enacted in a number of these municipalities to allow a dual filing, and that's been the trajectory and the trend. But it is an additional challenge. Also, at the time when many of these laws were passed, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission was not taking cases related to sexual orientation or gender identity because it was not included in the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. So, so from an administrative remedy standpoint, this was the only option. Also, that was the case with HUD, going back and forth a little bit, because under the Obama administration, the Secretary of HUD did expand protections for LGBTQ people. Those protections were rescinded under President Trump's administration and have now been brought back under President Biden. In 2018, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission issued landmark guidelines to interpret sex more inclusively, specifically to talk about sex stereotypes as a way to think about discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. Basically, that is broad, and it can mean multiple things. It can mean a person who is assigned female at birth and is therefore assumed by society to be living with a person assigned male at birth, but is a lesbian same-sex couple, and based on sex stereotyping about what who women would live in a home with, PHRC could hear that kind of case. It could also hear cases related to a person's gender identity as well. So that was in 2018. And in 2020, last June, the US Supreme Court issued a 6-3 ruling in Bostock versus Clayton County, which expanded in the same way of looking at the definition of sex, clarified that sex discrimination is inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, this was specific to employment cases. However, the same rationale was used that PHRC had used in its guidelines. So many observers would agree that the Bostock case in large part protects the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission's LGBT guidelines. And what's more, the Biden administration has expanded, has fully implemented the Bostock ruling and issued a HUD memorandum clarifying that it also applies to housing. We'll talk about that shortly. So current protections in place. So in municipalities, Greater Lehigh Valley municipalities, including Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Reading, and Stroudsburg, have enacted local human relations ordinances. There's currently more than 60 statewide. These are the only ones, the ones that I named, Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Reading, and Stroudsburg, are the only municipalities that have these local protections in the counties of Lehigh, Northampton, Berks, and Monroe counties. There's no ordinances in Carbon County either. So for the purpose of thinking about the Greater Lehigh Valley, of the more than 60 ordinances, we actually only have 5 in our broad Greater Lehigh Valley region: Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Reading, and Stroudsburg. Each of these laws are slightly different, and only the cities of Allentown and Reading have staff for their commissions. The other ones are all volunteer commissions. In fact, Easton actually does not even have commissioners appointed. Mayor Panto has actually never appointed commissioners, to my knowledge. So we have a law in the books with really no practical way for an attorney to file a complaint in the city of Easton, since there's no people appointed to hear those cases. So you can already see some of the challenges with municipal ordinances, as important as they are to pass, to provide the legal recourse, to be able to receive a right to sue letter, to create a civil action. It is not a be-all, end-all. What we really need is robust state and federal protections. In Pennsylvania, under state law, PHRC's 2018 LGBT guidelines, the commission is interpreting sex to be inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity, as we just discussed. And this does not preclude the necessity of legislative action in Pennsylvania, and legislators have failed in their responsibilities for dozens of years to pass comprehensive statewide LGBT legal protections in housing, employment, public accommodation. In fact, here in the Lehigh Valley, this proposal is championed by Republican State Senator Pat Brown, who is the prime sponsor of the bill in the Senate, and it has bipartisan support in both the House and State Senate, and yet it has languished for years. So the guidelines are guidelines; they are not a statute, and advocates would still like to see a statute change by the legislature to fully enshrine and clarify that this is the law in our state. The Bostock case is very significant, however. So the Supreme Court's opinion in Bostock not only protects PHRC's guidelines, but really makes this the law of the land in all 50 states, at least for now. It's possible, theoretically, that there could be a court challenge to the housing component related to this, because the Supreme Court's opinion was related to employment, and the case itself in Bostock was related to employment. It's possible that there could be a challenge to the housing piece, and that is part of the reason why we need enshrined federal protections in law, and as well as PHRC's LGBT guidelines have not been tested in court. There has not been a case that has been brought to PHRC on LGBT, based on these LGBTQ guidelines, adjudicated and then challenged in court. That has not happened yet. So even though I believe that Bostock protects the PHRC guidelines. That's my personal opinion. Again, I'm not a lawyer. And I think that the reality that it hasn't been tested in court means that we still could benefit from more specific statutory changes. Excuse me. President Biden, on day one of his presidency, signed an executive order that expands Bostock. And very shortly, HUD released a memo that confirms that fair housing protections are inclusive of LGBTQ people. And that's all fair housing protection. So, any protections available through HUD, that includes FHA mortgages, that includes, Section 8 housing. It includes any fair housing protections that HUD has authority over are now inclusive. That even would include HUD-funded shelters, which the Trump administration repealed LGBT protections for homeless shelters. So this would bring that back. Of course, within federal or state law, none of this is yet enshrined. So these are all executive actions by state and federal agencies, with the exception of Bostock, which is a Supreme Court opinion. But in terms of PHRC and HUD, these are agency level actions that could be changed by future administrations, as we saw happened between Obama and Trump. In addition, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau issued an interpretive rule on March 9th that clarified that the prohibition against sex discrimination under ECOA includes sexual orientation and gender identity. This is specifically applicable to mortgage lenders or any lenders. But the reason that I'm bringing it up here in this presentation is that credit discrimination for access of purchasing a home would now, there would now be this protection in place. However, this is a rule, not a law. And so there is still a need for enshrined federal protections to be in place. And so here's the big problem. A person's housing protections should not change based on their zip code. That is currently the situation in Pennsylvania. If we're not looking at the rules that have been put in place and we're only looking at the laws on the books, this is confusing and unsustainable for community members. People don't know what their rights are. They don't know. They don't even often know what municipality they live in, because most people think it's based on their postal address. So, we've had numerous people call Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center thinking that they're protected by Allentown's law, but in reality, they live in Salisbury Township. Or they call us thinking that they live in Bethlehem, but they really live in Fountain Hill. And those protections are not in place in those additional municipalities. So with these problems, we have a confusing patchwork. And so progress is progress. And so we want to support and uplift all of these 60 plus municipal civil rights laws that have been passed with the dedication and courage and bravery of advocates and local activists on the ground in communities all across Pennsylvania and all across America. In fact, Pennsylvania is the state with the most municipal protections to still lack a state law. It's also the only state in the Northeast without a statewide law in place. But these municipal laws also aren't, in addition to not being sufficient to cover everyone, the guidances that are statewide from PHRC and federal guidances in the federal executive actions from the president, these are excellent and really necessary in many ways to provide recourse immediately in real time. But they can be repealed by future administrations, as we saw what President Trump did to the Obama era protections that were enacted. And of course, we also have a knowledge gap. Community members and also attorneys are often unaware of the current protections in place to provide recourse for LGBTQ discrimination in housing. We frequently hear that community members called an attorney who told them that they weren't protected. In actual fact, they are, and they have recourse that they could seek. But because this is an evolving area of law, many attorneys are not aware that there are currently state and federal protections in place, in addition to possibly municipal ordinances in place that can provide recourse for a client. So there's a significant knowledge gap, and that's why it's important that you're all here today. But also, these issues continue to evolve on a very frequent basis. with that, we're going to take another quick poll. And when the poll goes up, I'm gonna just pause myself for another moment. This is a good time where if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer questions so far as well.
So Adrian, I got messaged one question about the kind of timeline and comparing it with other timelines for various rights of groups. Teresa has asked, whenever it might be appropriate, but in your opinion, have the fair housing rights of people of color advanced along a similar timeline in PA, asking on behalf of a newly formed NAACP chapter?
That's a great question. Teresa, if I don't answer the question the way that you were asking it, then please let us know in the chat if there's a follow-up. But so the Fair Housing Act does specifically enumerate race. So in terms of the very specific, very clear-cut cases of discrimination, those are already enshrined into federal and state law. However, we know that that doesn't eliminate, race-based discrimination in housing. That there's many other ways that discriminators actively engage in discrimination against individuals based on their race. So, I think that in terms of the legal protections, the LGBT civil rights movement has moved on a faster pace than expected, and yet still lacks the enumerated legal protections that other protected classes have. And yet we also know that protection in the law is not sufficient to ending the practices of discrimination. It is a critical first step in ending those practices, but in reality, we know that it does not end the practices of discrimination by itself. That's why we actually need independent investigative and adjudicatory bodies, such as Municipal Human Relations Commissions, Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and EEOC and HUD, to really address the pervasiveness of this challenge. And when we pass enumerated laws that specifically enshrine LGBT civil rights protections into the Fair Housing Act, that will also not end the practice of discrimination against LGBTQ people in housing. So it will require continued effort, both in terms of advocacy, in terms of representation of clients, in terms of continuing to evolve as technology and the lived landscape of LGBTQ people's lives change, in the same way that we see that with race, right? So like the protections in law that were written in 1968 were written based on the lens of 1968, and things are different today than they were in 1968. So there are things that are pervasive in housing discrimination for Black and brown people, for example, today that weren't considered in the 60s because they didn't exist then. So there's different ways of needing to continuously evolve the law, and I think that that's frankly a challenge of this area of work, is that the issues continuously change. Even if we're just talking about LGBTQ people and the municipal non-discrimination laws that have been passed for a while, we look at, for example, the language in the Allentown Ordinance that passed in 2002. That was leading edge, groundbreaking language in 2002, and today it would not be. So 19 years later, we would benefit actually from updating that language to ensure that it is fully protective of the entire community. For example, the definition of sexual orientation that was written in 2002 says, it says like heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual are the definitions. Well, today we have a large number of people who identify as asexual as their sexual orientation, and they're not actually enshrined into Allentown's law, right? So we have new ways of using language that didn't exist even 19 years ago, let alone if we're talking about legislation that was passed in 1968. And I don't think that the LGBT community is unique, that many minoritized and marginalized populations, that the language we use to discuss our own communities evolves over time. So Teresa, if that didn't fully answer your question, I invite you to put something in the chat and ask a follow-up question as well. For now, I'm going to move to the next slide. So the timeline of change. So if we look, we're going to start in 1974 when Congresswoman Bella Abzug first introduced a federal LGBTQ civil rights bill. And this bill dealt with both employment as well as housing. And to quote from the bill prohibits discrimination on the account of sex, marital status, and sexual orientation in federally assisted programs and in housing sales, rentals, financing, and brokerage services. Gender identity wasn't a commonly used term in 1974, really not until about 25 years later, 20 to 25 years later. So this bill, had it been passed in 1974, we would be seeking to update it to add gender identity in. And while this isn't like an LGBT 101, I should just define these two terms. So sexual orientation means, your identity as a person who is either heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual. Gender identity is how you identify your sense of your gender, how you think of your gender, male, female, non-binary. And so gender identity is not part of sex or sex discrimination. However, in the interpretations of the word sex, we are seeing courts and federal and state agencies interpret the word sex to be inclusive of sexual orientation, gender, and gender identity. And yet we still want these two terms to be enshrined into the law. So in 2013, the Senate passed for the first time an employment-only version of Bella Abzug's bill called the Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So 1974 to 2013, that's how long it took to pass a much pared-back version of the bill, and it did not pass the House, it only passed the Senate. By the way, Senator Toomey voted for it, and so did a handful of Republican senators, including Senator Portman, Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski. So this bill passes the Senate with critical bipartisan support in 2013 and is not passed through the House, and therefore does not become law. The issue does not return until 2019 when the Equality Act, which is basically going back to Bella Abzug's first bill, a fully inclusive bill, not only of sexual orientation and gender identity, but also of employment, housing, public accommodation. And the Equality Act now has been expanded to try to include jury service and credit discrimination. This bill passes the US House with, again, bipartisan support in 2019, does not get a vote in the US Senate. Then in 2020, the Supreme Court opinion in Bostock versus Clayton County really sets the stage for the Equality Act to come back. I don't think that anyone expected a 6-3 opinion, and also nobody expected one of the conservative justices to draft the opinion. So this opinion is pretty clear, and it expands the definition of sex to be inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity for purposes of discrimination, especially in employment. That's the Bostock case. 2021, President Biden is inaugurated. Day one, signs an executive order. Shortly thereafter, we get a memorandum from HUD fully implementing Bostock at HUD and expanding Bostock to housing discrimination. Then on March 9th, we get the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau rule that does the same thing for credit. So we see between 2019 with the House passage to 2021, the impact of Bostock is now that we have federal protections in housing and credit discrimination, and yet it's not within the law, and it's not known by most LGBTQ people, and frankly not known by most attorneys that are except attorneys that are really specialized in housing discrimination. Then in 2021, in February 2021, that actually the purple should have been where the blue is. So in February 2021, the Equality Act passes the US House, again with bipartisan support, including in Pennsylvania, with support from Representative Brian Fitzpatrick in Bucks County, one of 3 Republicans in the country to vote for the Equality Act. This bill is now waiting to be considered in the Senate. It had a committee hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee in March, and there is not yet a known date for when the Senate may consider this bill. There currently are not any Republican co-sponsors of the bill in the Senate. So what is the Equality Act? The Equality Act is a landmark piece of legislation that would update federal civil rights protections in housing, employment, credit, jury service, and public accommodation to provide explicit and enduring protections from discrimination based on a person's sexual orientation and gender identity. And this issue has broad public support, 76% support across the board. It's about 73% support in Pennsylvania, bipartisan support, including from 62% of Republicans. Pretty much every way we cut these numbers, we see majority support. We see majority support of self-identified Catholics. We see majority support of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. We see majority support in every region of the country, and including support from the industries that would be regulated, real estate professionals, regional chambers of commerce, Fortune 500 companies. They all agree with groups like labor unions and tenant rights organizations that the Equality Act is really essential and necessary. Even those agencies that would be regulated, such as real estate professionals, like Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors, for example, has publicly supported these issues because they understand that even though, yes, it's a regulation on their members, it's a regulation on the real estate industry, it's a regulation that frankly they want. It strengthens the industry by making it clear that discrimination is not a value of real estate. Fair housing is a value of real estate. And that's really what we see here. And so we're seeing more and more businesses, real estate professionals, and coalitions such as realtor organizations and chambers of commerce supporting this issue. Here in the Lehigh Valley, there's also support, for example, from Greater Lehigh Valley Chamber of Commerce, from Air Products and PPL, from major corporations in our region who have all come together to say that this is essential. And here's a voice from one lender. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how credit discrimination relates to fair housing. So Howie Meller is the president and CEO of People First Federal Credit Union. And in an op-ed he wrote in the Morning Call on February 15th of this year, Howie wrote, "Credit discrimination is wrong in the Lehigh Valley. It's wrong in Pennsylvania, and it's wrong across America. So while we welcome Senator Boscola's new and innovative legislation, Senator Boscola introduced a state-level legislation to ban credit discrimination for LGBTQ people in Pennsylvania, not dealing with housing, just with access to credit for housing. We also hope that U.S. Senator Pat Toomey will publicly support a federal solution to LGBT credit discrimination, such as the Equality Act, which would update federal law to include express and enduring non-discrimination protections for 13 million LGBTQ Americans across virtually every area of daily life, including housing, employment, credit, jury service, and public accommodation." And Howie's not alone. In fact, competitors don't always agree on everything, but here is People First's largest competitor in our region is First Commonwealth Federal Credit Union, and their CEO, Donna Listacco, wrote the following on their credit union's website. "Protections from discrimination are necessary for all Americans seeking loans. These protections should be preserved into law. There's no question these protections are good for financial service sectors. There must be clear and unquestionable guidelines and rules that don't change from state to state or from city to city to empower the American dream for everyone. Many lenders operate across city or state lines, and one set of rules for all of us helps to ensure that our entire industry is prepared to succeed." So again, this is the voice of a lender and an industry leader in the financial service industry saying, not only do we believe that non-discrimination protections are essential, but we also, can't really live with this patchwork of laws. where, you know, if you're writing a mortgage document in the city of Allentown, there's a different set of laws than in Salisbury Township. Or if you're writing a mortgage document in Pennsylvania, it's different than the laws in New Jersey. One set of non-discrimination laws that are comprehensive for the whole country is what's needed by the industry itself. That's what the industry needs to thrive, to reduce the likelihood of lawsuits against them, to reduce the likelihood of inadvertent mistakes where a lender accidentally discriminates against a client. The financial service sector is pretty much universally in agreement that one federal set of protections is better for the industry. But, you know, lawyers who make money from these kinds of cases, you know, from a financial perspective, might like the complication of it, but I think from a client management perspective and trying to represent the client to the best of one's ability, clear and unquestionable set of laws for the whole country is a benefit for lawyers and for your clients as well. And here's a tweet that that the Realtor Action organization sent out in 2018, praising Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors for their commitment to LGBT inclusive fair housing practices. So Pennsylvania is one of 31 states that, and there's one more state, Virginia, that has passed a statewide law since this tweet. Pennsylvania is one of 31 states that does not have statewide protection for sexual orientation or gender identity. So the Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors CEO and president signed a business pledge that commits the association to LGBT-friendly practices. Fair housing makes us stronger. This is the Realtors Association saying that fair housing makes us stronger. I think that's really important. By the way, Greater Lehigh Valley Realtors also passed a resolution supporting municipal, state, and federal expansion of fair housing protections to include sexual orientation and gender identity, and that was approved also in 2018.
Hey, Adrian, we have a question here.
Okay.
How does credit discrimination happen?
Would it be possible for the person who asked that question to unmute themselves and maybe clarify the question a little bit? So are you asking, like, how does it happen logistically, or how does it happen in terms of like what's an experience of someone who's been discriminated against? So if you're comfortable either clarifying in the chat or unmuting yourself to ask, that would be welcome.
In the chat, he says, could you please give examples?
Yeah, sure. So, so credit discrimination can look like a variety of things. It could look like a mortgage lender denying a loan to a same-sex couple. More likely, it's not denying the loan, but increasing fees or interest. So having arbitrary reasons to increase fees. And we'll actually get to, I have some data that I'll present about this shortly that discusses how credit discrimination impacts same-sex couples. There's been a lot less research done on how credit discrimination impacts transgender people. And that's probably where we're more likely to see denials of care. In general, the financial service sector makes money from loans. So they typically aren't looking to deny services, but this is where we might see you know, a more local based lender that, in the same ways as we saw credit discrimination impacting you know, Black communities before that was illegal, you know, in terms of neighborhoods that are either all or majority white. You know, we could imagine a local lender not really wanting to provide loans that would allow someone to buy a home in a neighborhood that is, you know, perhaps a majority Christian neighborhood, for example, or something like that. So those are the main ways where we would see credit discrimination. Now, credit discrimination is not only related to housing, of course. People get loans for all things in their lives, car loans or student loans, or, you know, there's different reasons to get loans. And what we also know is that access to credit is access to the ability to, for example, buy a home. So if a lender is discriminating against an LGBTQ person, it limits their ability to achieve that part of the American dream. It's not quite as common as what we might think of when we think of housing discrimination in terms of like a landlord-tenant issue or a realtor issue. However, the reason that we have fair credit laws in this country is because there has been history of credit discrimination in this country targeting populations that are historically marginalized. And so I think that what I'm going to share shortly will answer more of your questions in terms of the data. But if you have further questions when we get to that, please feel free to add in the chat. So here's the credit discrimination. I didn't know it was the next slide. I would have just gone right to it. Credit discrimination. So there was a study from the Iowa State University that looked at applicants for mortgages in the United States, across the United States. And they found that applicants for mortgages are more likely to be denied a loan if they're a same-sex couple, and that when loans are approved, the interest rates and fees are higher. In fact, 73% of same-sex couples are more likely to be denied a loan. So a significant disparity there. The same study also found that there were higher fees when loans were approved, and that's a challenge. There's a lot of I'll use the word flexibility that mortgage loan writers have in figuring out what fees they're going to charge. I remember that I've between Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center and my own personal life, I've dealt with the purchase of 3 different properties, and each time I negotiated the fees differently with the lender. I'm not willing to pay that fee. I'm bringing my own notary. I'm not paying for your notary. I'm not paying for FedEx fees. But we also know that people from historically minoritized and marginalized communities are less likely to sometimes negotiate and are also less likely to be successful negotiating. So this is especially true when we look at intersectionality within the LGBTQ community. We look at LGBTQ people of color and LGBTQ women and transgender people, that there may be less of a willingness or effectiveness with negotiation. The Filene report also took a look at credit discrimination in the LGBT community, specifically looking at same-sex couples. So they found that same-sex couples are less likely to own property and hold mortgages, and also that a majority of the LGBT population confirmed strong or moderate concerns about being denied a home mortgage solely because of their sexual orientation, not due to financial considerations. So not that they are, for example, that LGBT people are more likely to be denied mortgage because of poverty or because of poor credit. And as a population, that our population has higher instances of poor credit. That's not what the report looked at. This report only looked at, do people have concerns about being denied solely because of their sexual orientation? So I can tell you that at Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center, we're frequently asked for referrals for LGBTQ welcoming real estate professionals and lenders. For this reason, people are concerned about being treated with equity in a process such as buying a home. It's a very emotional process to begin with, and people don't want to go through with something that they feel that they may not be treated equitably. So here are some ways that attorneys can be involved. So first, let me just ask the question about credit discrimination. After seeing some of the data, are there any follow-up questions there? Did that answer the question? Okay, great. So here are some ways that attorneys can be involved. So first, attorneys can provide high-quality representation for clients. So can and should vigorously represent clients by filing LGBTQ housing discrimination cases at the federal, state, and local levels. At the federal level, cases can currently be filed via HUD or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or depending on the situation, at the state level with the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and where relevant with municipal commissions. So in the Lehigh Valley, Allentown, Bethlehem, Easton, Reading, and Stroudsburg. Attorneys should be aware of the need to exhaust all administrative remedies and should be aware of the need to dual file a case when necessary. And there's a really great book from the Pennsylvania Bar institute that is called Practice Before the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. That it's not quite like a beach read. It's more like a a big handbook, but it has all of the information that attorneys need to know to be able to represent clients based on the statute and case law related to Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. So that's useful for attorneys that are seeking to get into this field of fair housing if it's not already a field that they're involved with. And by the way, we also frequently hear from clients that they have a really difficult time finding attorneys to represent them for fair housing cases. We know that it's not the most profitable area of law for attorneys to work in, and I think that attorneys know that too. So clients frequently are told by multiple firms that the firm does not handle fair housing cases unless it might be a very high profile case. So that's a challenge. We know that it's a challenge. Any attorney that deals with real estate law should be able to deal with credit discrimination. Any attorney that deals with employment discrimination should also be able to deal with housing discrimination. It's not a complicated area of law to file cases before these commissions. It just requires a little bit of knowledge and learning. So that's the next thing is it's an evolving area of law. And what's being shared today may be different than the legal landscape in 6 months. The law continues to evolve on the local, state, and federal level. By the time we're finished with this webinar, there could be another municipal law that's passed. Not really, because it's like 11 a.m., but in reality, like every month or so, we're seeing another municipality in Pennsylvania pass a municipal non-discrimination law. These changes are happening very frequently because, frankly, Pennsylvanians are tired of not having legal recourse, and advocates are working hard to enshrine these protections into law where they can, which may be at the local level. New attorneys should also be trained on fair housing law. I recently met with a partner of a local law firm and a brand new associate attorney who was just hired. And we met because this new associate attorney had an interest in dealing with discrimination cases, and it's not an area of expertise that the firm is involved with now, currently. It's a smaller law firm in the region. And I was really impressed that not only did the new associate reach out, but actually the partner attorney came to the meeting as well and was really interested in allowing the associate attorney to develop their expertise in this field, but also to ensure that firm resources would be made available to that attorney for continuous learning through not only the law but also the community. One thing that law firms can also do is to offer info sessions to help individuals know their fair housing rights, because a lot of community members that we hear from, it's very unclear to them what their housing rights are. Again, if we see housing as a human right, we also need to empower people to fight for that human right for themselves, for their families, for their communities. Many clients who are experiencing housing discrimination are without the financial means to hire an attorney. Not everyone. Housing discrimination, cuts across all kinds of lines. But what we hear frequently at Bradbury-Sullivan Center is that, simply referring a client who's experienced housing discrimination to an attorney that might cost too much for them, with a case that might take a couple years to be resolved, is not a tenable situation for most of our clients that we are serving at Bradbury-Sullivan Center. So one of the challenges with the legal remedies is that they take a long time. On the local level, they are quickest, but the remedies are also the lowest, so the smallest. At the state level, cases can frankly take a couple years, which I think we all acknowledge is longer than we would like it to take. But they do take a couple years, and certainly HUD cases can also take a long time. So one of the benefits that can be made available is when people file with a municipal commission, they can get a right to sue letter and deal with the action in civil court. And so that's an area where we've seen some volunteer or pro bono attorneys be able to support clients to be able to do that, to help them with the initial filing, to get the right to sue letter, and then to try to represent them in civil court. So that's another option. I know that both North Penn Legal Services as well as Bradbury-Sullivan LGBT Community Center have opportunities for lawyers to want to do some pro bono time. We have a free legal clinic at Bradbury-Sullivan Center, as I mentioned earlier. Lawyers volunteer, 2 hours about every other month on rotation. So we have about 6 law firms that participate, and we are certainly welcoming additional attorneys to volunteer their time in this way. And finally, advocate. So attorneys, especially those who file discrimination who file discrimination cases on behalf of complainants, can and should advocate vocally, publicly, for the express and enduring protections that the Equality Act would provide. Your voice as an attorney to talk about the confusing patchwork of civil rights laws and the need for one fair and comprehensive set of laws for at least our state, if not our country, is actually a really useful voice. It's similar to the useful voice of the financial service sector in that attorneys are the ones that are hearing mostly from clients and are also aware of the challenges of filing these cases. So your voice is really powerful, and encourage you to share your voice based on your experience in your profession about what your clients need, which is more protections, clearer and easier to understand protections, and more consistent protections for their for their lives. Because again, without housing, everything else really doesn't. It's hard to prioritize anything else if we don't have a safe place to live, right? So I want to share, it was in my bio, it was mentioned that I'm the editor of this book, Bodies and Barriers, Queer Activists on Health. And to tie in housing and health for LGBTQ people, I wanted to share an essay from Dr. Amani Woody. Dr. Woody is a housing advocate for LGBTQ older adults in Washington, D.C. And she's the founder of Mary's House for Older Adults, which is a senior LGBT senior housing in Washington, D.C. And Amani wrote, "I'm pretty sure that when U.S. actress Bette Davis said getting old ain't for sissies, she wasn't referring to gay older adults specifically, but to the challenges that aging can bring to us all, no matter our sexual orientation or gender identity. Old is not the destination to be traveling in our youth-obsessed culture. The politics of age have made growing old with maladies almost feel like a crime, something we're not ready to cop to, therefore making many of us invisible. I remember when my then 78-year-old grandmother asked me who I was calling old when I referred to her and some of her peers as old. Getting there myself, old age could be particularly challenging for LGBT, same-gender loving baby boomers and older adults born during the silent generation. We've all heard that 50 is the new 40 and disrupt aging, as if living to be 50 years old and getting older are not only biological markers of human species, but gifts. Ageism is hardwired into our institutional systems and can systematically attack from inside. One 67-year-old African-American lesbian elder cited her experience. I would say that getting older in this country is difficult because we have no reverence for the elderly, which is not true in a lot of cultures. So when you add another stigma to it, now only I'm old, I'm an African-American female, and females in this country, in my experience, have been that you don't enjoy the same reverence as men do. And when you add African-American to that, it's even less. So now I'm already pretty far down. And then when you add being lesbian, well, that puts you in the toilet. Here's the voice of a 60-year-old Black trans woman. I'm the biggest advocate for my own care, but frequently it can be frustrating. I had an incident with one of the case managers in a large medical facility. When I tried to report it, it seemed like no one wanted to hear it. I completely lost medical coverage and benefits for 2 years, and it was really frustrating to get it back. For about 4 months, I had nothing and tried to explain that my health was in jeopardy. I needed medicine for my heart and I have diabetes. I contacted CMS and they weren't always helpful. I just want to be as healthy as I can be, and sometimes I get tired mentally, emotionally, and physically. If I were younger, I wouldn't be dismissed so easily. A lifetime of discrimination has reduced the support networks and economic security of many LGBT older adults, leaving them vulnerable to housing instability at a critical point in their lives. And many are priced out of housing. Federal guidelines state that when 30% of your income's for housing, it's a housing burden, while saying 50% of your income for housing is a severe burden. In many states, a one-bedroom apartment costs more than 100% of a Social Security check. A 70-something lesbian who's led an amazing life contacted me. She was standing a couple of rows from Dr. King when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. Her current residence is being sold by the owner. She can't do a huge number of stairs and can afford only about $400 to $450 a month. She was asking, can you help? At Mary's House, we provide information and referrals and coordinate access to government and local programs. However, we also know that there will never be enough affordable, culturally competent housing to support the great tsunami of LGBT older adults. We know that the education of existing residences and providers for culturally affirming care is paramount to eliminating barriers to housing care. Our first residence is a model of communal living with 15 single occupancy rooms. This will be replicated on smaller scales throughout the United States. Housing is a social determinant of health, and housing is a human right. So as LGBT people age, these issues also continue. When LGBT people are considered through an intersectional lens of also being older, or also being people of color, or also being disabled people, the challenges with housing discrimination continue and in many ways are exacerbated. So today's presentation is meant to be an overview, a broad overview of the evolving areas of fair housing law when it comes to LGBTQ plus people, and to invite you to do further learning and further conversations within your firms or amongst each other within the legal profession to try to expand the protections even further and fully be able to represent clients to assist anyone experiencing housing discrimination with the ability to make a claim. So I'm going to end the screen share so I can see you, and I'm happy to discuss any questions that you might have.
Adrian, we do have one question here. Diane asks, have you seen any issues in LGBT individuals obtaining homeowners insurance?
That's a good question. I haven't personally seen that issue. That doesn't mean it's not an issue. And I'm not sure that, I don't believe that that would be covered under credit discrimination. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think that, I think insurance rules are different than credit rules. I know that in Pennsylvania, there is a conversation about expanding insurance protections, insurance non-discrimination protections, and that that has not yet moved forward. So there are not currently federal or state protections for sexual orientation or gender identity in insurance. However, I haven't heard of that in terms of people being outright denied. I presume that what we would see is that since insurance is such a highly regulated field, that it would be much harder for a homeowner's insurance company to deny coverage. What we might see more likely, I'm guessing, I'm a little bit like projecting here, what we might see more likely is that people might be sold amounts of insurance that are different than what they need. And that a community member might feel that that's their only option. So that's my guess. I can tell you that I've actually had conversations with the Pennsylvania Insurance Commissioner's office, and they have not yet been able to move through any regulatory process to try to add non-discrimination protections. We were actually looking at other types of insurance, but it's the same process for all of them. So it's a long answer to say, I don't know. But I don't think that outright denials with the homeowners are really the most likely. And by the way, one of the challenges related to insurance is also renter's insurance, and trying to make sure that LGBTQ people are aware, so LGBTQ people are less likely to be homeowners. And so trying to educate our community on the need for renter's insurance is also something that that's important, and yet there are not non-discrimination protections in insurance right now. It was a great question, Diane. I know that Teresa asked a question earlier in the chat, and it was asked verbally, but now I'm seeing a little bit more of the question here. So I just want to go back to that. So the question again was, our communities of color have been especially challenged in the Williamsport area. This is becoming the lead issue of our new Tri-Lycoming NAACP chapter. We've been working on developing independent human rights commissions to enhance advocacy. So the reason that, in my opinion, the reason that we need independent agencies and not simply put the police in charge of non-discrimination protections, for example, is that, well, we can have a whole nother webinar about if we should have police in this country. My opinion is no, but this is not an area for criminal law. This is an area for civil law. So we want to have, protections that are able to be administered civilly, and that requires independent agencies. Also, historically, if it doesn't take that far looking back, to remember that sometimes law enforcement were perpetuating the harm when it comes to, for example, race-based discrimination, that law enforcement sometimes actually helped to protect all white communities. So there's a community trust issue as well, and the need to ensure independent agencies. So nowhere in Lycoming County doesn't have any municipal non-discrimination laws that includes LGBTQ people. Williamsport and Altoona would be the two largest municipalities in Pennsylvania that don't have a non-discrimination law. I don't know why I know that offhand, but Altoona is slightly larger than Williamsport, so it's the two of you, and it would be really useful for those laws to be passed. There's model legislation that can very easily be replicated in another city, as long as it's a city of the same class. So that is absolutely really useful, and yet it doesn't resolve the issue of the confusing patchwork of civil rights laws, right? So one of the reasons that a place like Williamsport would really benefit from this is because you have a lot of renters who are college students, and college students who might be very comfortable in their identities on campus and are now interacting with landlords off campus. This is actually a fairly common area where we see housing discrimination, where landlords are really uncomfortable maybe renting to college students in general and use LGBT identity as pretext. So that's an area that we have seen and something that would be useful. So for Teresa, I would encourage you to consider looking at advocating for a Williamsport municipal ordinance related to this. And I will put my email in the chat here. Happy to share model language. The city of Scranton has a good one also that's not too far. So, that's one strategy. Like cities, we'll talk to other cities. Are there any other questions? Oh, sorry.
Adrian, I have a question, a direct question to me actually. For you, is that have you seen any issues or cases in public housing or Section 8 in the state of Pennsylvania of LGBT discrimination?
So I'm going to answer this in terms of publicly funded housing. So under the Obama era HUD rule, there was our organization actually filed a HUD complaint against the Allentown Rescue Mission when they threw a gay person out on the street in the middle of the night. The Rescue Mission continues to say that they don't discriminate, but we've had so many clients tell us their stories of discrimination of the Rescue Mission, more than we can count. And actually the Rescue Mission's response was to return federal funds. So that was how they responded. They didn't want to defend the case. They simply returned their federal funds to HUD and continued their policy of discriminating against LGBTQ people. At least to our knowledge, that's what happened. They say that they don't continue to discriminate, but we continue to hear that they do. So that's covered under federally funded, HUD-funded shelters. I'm not aware personally of a specific example of discrimination in Section 8 housing. I am aware of examples of discrimination in FHA loans, but by both realtors and lenders. So that, yes. And I know that there are experiences related to Section 8 housing. I just don't have a specific example to share, like off the top of my head. So under the current HUD memo, we have current protections for people living in Section 8 housing in receiving mortgages through FHA, staying at shelters that are HUD funded, basically anything that deals with HUD. It does not impact the private sector housing market at this point. We would need expanded federal protections for that. However, from the credit side, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau does impact the private sector because they regulate all lenders from that side, from that perspective. So there are some. It's a patchwork. It's a patchwork both municipally and in terms of what the federal protections are. And it's complex and it changes like every week. And that's why we need more comprehensive protections that provide clarification. There's a clarification in here. Early on, did I say that local non-discrimination ordinances were written so that use of the local Human Relations Commission precludes the victim from going to PA, but they're being amended to allow victims to. So Craig, thank you for asking for that clarification. No, that was not what I meant to say. So if that's how it came across, then I definitely want to clarify. Municipal non-discrimination laws before 2018 in Pennsylvania were written because Pennsylvania did not have sexual orientation or gender identity in any way that people could file a complaint with PHRC. So for example, if person A is a resident of the city of Bethlehem and they needed to file a complaint in 2011, they would only be allowed to file it with the city of Bethlehem. In 2018, that changed when PHRC issued guidance allowing sex discrimination to be inclusive of sexual orientation and gender identity. So at that point, now people can dual file, and there are greater remedies available at the state level than the municipal level. It also takes a longer time for a case to be heard, but it wasn't so people don't have to file with PHRC. It was that they weren't able to file those cases with PHRC because PHRC could not hear them. I'm trying to just understand the last part of this question. They're being amended to allow victims to use either or both. What I'm seeing right now that's happening is people are dual filing, not choosing, because of the concern about not having exhausted administrative remedies. So people now the case can be heard in both places, they dual file, and most of the municipalities that have local ordinances have an MOU with the state that creates an automatic dual filing process. Not every municipality has, but most have, and that reduces the pressure on the complainant, who basically your client, to have to know that they would have to dual file. So for example, if somebody were to file, I believe that Harrisburg has this. So if they were to file in the city of Harrisburg, it would be automatically dual filed. One or the other would investigate it. So the investigation wouldn't happen in both places, but like either PHRC or the municipal body would investigate. There's also similar MOUs with HUD and PHRC that allow for the dual filing. So I hope that answers the question. If not, that gets a little bit into like a legal process area that I don't want to go deeper in because I'm not an attorney. And so I would recommend that book I mentioned. I'll type it in here. It's called Practice Before the PA Human Relations Commission. And it's published by PBI, Pennsylvania Bar Institute. So I would recommend that for those kind of like very specific like legal processes, because I don't want to advise anyone incorrectly. Are there any other questions? There was a question that came to me directly that I'll just paraphrase. In allegedly the freest country on earth, why is there no federal protection discrimination across the board? Great question. I mean, I would love to see, I think many of us would love to see just a very clear federal protection. And frankly, I think that that's what advocates were attempting with the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Now, I'm too young to have been, I wasn't alive in 1968, so I can't speak for them. But what I can say is that I think that, based on anyone's read of the Fair Housing Act, it's clear that when it was passed, it was intended to be comprehensive, but that there's been an evolution since 1968 about what does it mean to be comprehensive, which communities were not included. But in 1968, that's a year before Stonewall. You know, people wouldn't have known to include sexual orientation or really thought to do it. And in 1974, when Bella Abzug introduced that first federal bill to address gay and lesbian discrimination, it didn't include transgender people because in 1974, that wasn't a commonplace thing to consider. So I think that, you know, even with the attempt of having that comprehensive law in 1968, that we could pass a comprehensive law today, and in 20 or 30 or 40 years, it's going to need an update as well, because we will continue to evolve as a people and as a population.
Adrian, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the protections that we have in Pennsylvania have not been challenged in court. Do you think that's because issues are getting resolved at the PHRC level satisfactory, or is there another reason that we're not seeing that they're not being brought to court?
Well, Tim, that's a great question, and I should just clarify. When you said the word "a lot" hasn't been challenged, I want to clarify that the municipal laws that are in place have been court tested. So the Allentown Human Relations Ordinance was challenged at Commonwealth Court and set a precedent in Pennsylvania that municipalities have the legal right to enact municipal non-discrimination protections, and that these municipal protections are not in violation of PHRA. So that has been tested and upheld. In terms of PHRC's LGBT guidance, that has not been court tested because a case hasn't been appealed, basically. So it would require a case that comes to PHRC that is not mediated, that then PHRC adjudicates, and then the respondent chooses to appeal on. So I can't speak about current or future cases to go further into that, but I can say that, like, PHRC made an adjudication in a case related to Neshaminy School District and the use of imagery that is related to Native American populations or indigenous populations, and like the school district is appealing our case. So they disagreed with our ruling, they appealed it to state court. So like that same process would have to happen to test this. However, that hasn't happened yet. So I wish I could answer more specifically, but I can't get into like which cases are mediated and which cases are not. There's a question that just came to me directly that I want to just pose out loud. I'll answer it out loud. So, does Bradbury-Sullivan Center assist voucher holders in their search for available units if an LGBTQ person comes to us? If so, where does the center help with interaction between tenant and owner in acquiring the rental? We do not do that kind of individual direct service. So it's not within our purview as an agency to do that work. We would probably refer the client to an agency like Community Action Committee that deals more with that kind of direct client assistance. If somebody came to us, however, because they were turned away with a voucher, we would, through our legal clinic, we could connect them with, and the way our legal clinic is structured is that they receive a half-hour consult with an attorney that is a specialist in a specific area, most of the time to inform them of their rights and or processes. It's not to resolve the issue for them. Like, that's where we're different than the North Penn Legal Service that can actually take on cases. We're not a legal service agency. So that's the difference there. But we would, at the very least, be able to give them information about what their rights are and make a referral that would help them along their way. Matt, I don't know if there's something NPLS does in that instance that you would want to acknowledge here in terms of, if somebody has a a Section 8 voucher and is turned away? Is that the kind of case, like, is there a process with North Penn Legal Service that you want to share with folks?
Well, someone experiencing a legal issue should definitely contact our intake line, and we can, triage that and see if that person qualifies for our services. We can hopefully get them to an advocate to address and go through their case. I'll put the intake number in the chat box in just a minute here. But I would just encourage anyone who experiences, discrimination that we do have a fair housing line as well. So they should contact that, and I can put that in the chat as well. But just contact our intake for sure.
Great, thank you. We might have time for one more question if there are any.
Adrian, I don't have a question, but I'll follow up a little bit on what Matt said. So fair housing issues and specifically public housing issues are generally a priority for us. And so, if someone were to come to us and had been denied a voucher, we would certainly look at those cases and review it for merit. And if there was something that we could do, we take those types of cases and we represent, and try and assist in those cases as best we can, according to the resources we have. We cover 20 counties, and some counties have more different funding for specifically fair housing issues. But the money that we have in the Lehigh Valley is, we generally have resources to do those types of cases.
And not only the resources you have, but also, probably you're looking at, what the laws are in place that would support the client as well.
Definitely.
And so it is, there is still this murkiness of, in law. Although I do think that there is an opportunity for folks to file cases with both PHRC and HUD at this point, or when credit related with Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So with that, it doesn't look like there's any other questions, at least that have come into me. So Tim and Matt, I'll turn it over to you for any final things from you all that you want to share about the rest of the conference, or any other things.
Thank you, Adrian. I just want to say thank you. Your presentation was excellent. I was excited to participate in it and to hear it and to learn quite a bit of new things. This is the second session, as I mentioned at the beginning, of our Fair Housing conference this year. There are 2 additional sessions that you all are welcome to register for coming up. Those will be Thursday. Is a session on fair housing and medical marijuana, and then that's the 22nd, and then Wednesday, April 28th, the current trends and new developments in fair housing testing. And I think that's an important step that is often difficult to take, but we should all look at our ability to participate in and to do, so that we can spot the issues. It's often hard to see these issues without testing them out. So thank you all for participating, especially Adrian. Thank you very much for your expertise in this area.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everyone.